The bridge over Coldwater Creek let go with a sound like a rifle volley, timbers snapping one after another, and Wilhelmina Boone felt the wagon bed drop out from beneath her as if the earth itself had opened its mouth to swallow her whole. She had been driving too fast. She knew that even as the front wheels struck the rotted crossbeam, even as the gray gelding screamed and reared against the traces. 3 miles behind her, in the white clapboard church at Placer Hollow, a congregation was still waiting for a bride who was never going to walk down that aisle, and Wilhelmina had pushed the horse hard because she believed, foolishly, that speed could outrun a promise made under threat. The spring melt had turned Coldwater Creek into something closer to a river, brown and swollen and furious with runoff from a winter that had buried the High Sierra under 20 feet of snow, and the county bridge, which had not been inspected since before the war, had simply had enough. The wagon tipped. Wilhelmina heard her own voice tear out of her throat, high and raw, and then the world became water and splintered wood and the terrible cold shock of a mountain creek that had been snow only days before. She did not remember deciding to jump clear of the wagon. She remembered only that one instant she was falling with it, her wedding dress heavy as a shroud around her legs, and the next instant a hand like an iron shackle had closed around her wrist and hauled her sideways through the current with a strength that felt less like rescue than like being caught in the jaws of something enormous. "Hold to me," a man's voice said, close to her ear, rough with effort. "Do not fight the water. Fight me instead if you must fight something, but do not fight the water." She had no breath to answer. The creek dragged at her skirts, at her boots, at the pins in her hair, and she clung to the stranger's forearm with both hands while he kicked them both toward the near bank, away from the wreckage of the wagon and the horse, which had, mercifully, scrambled free on its own and now stood trembling and wild-eyed in the shallows downstream. They came up onto a gravel bar gasping, both of them soaked to the bone, and Wilhelmina lay on her back for a moment staring up at a sky the color of a healing bruise, spring storm clouds piling over the ridgeline, and thought with strange clarity that she had wanted, an hour ago, to disappear. She had not intended it to happen quite like this. "You are a fool to have crossed that bridge in this season," the man said, once he had his own wind back. He was on one knee beside her, water sheeting off a canvas coat, a leather satchel of surveying instruments still somehow strapped across his chest. "2 more of them have gone down the same way since March. I have been telling the county for a month that the timbers were rotten clean through." Wilhelmina pushed herself up on her elbows, her whole body shaking, and looked at him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 30 years old, broad through the shoulder in the way of a man who worked with his hands and his back rather than a desk, with a square, sun-browned face and eyes the pale gray-blue of creek ice. There was nothing soft about him, and nothing cruel either, only a kind of steady, watchful competence that she recognized because she had spent her whole life around men who worked the land and precious little time around men who merely owned it. "I am obliged to you," she said, when she could speak. "I would have drowned. You very nearly did." His gaze dropped then to what she was wearing, and she saw the understanding come into his face slowly, the way weather comes over a ridge. White silk, sodden and ruined, lace at the collar torn loose and hanging like a broken wing. A wreath of orange blossom, crushed now, still somehow pinned in her dark hair. "You are dressed for a wedding," he said carefully. "I was," Wilhelmina said, and something in her voice must have told him not to ask the rest of it yet, because he only nodded once, businesslike, and got to his feet, and held out his hand to help her up. "My name is Warren Granger," he said. "I am a surveyor for the Sierra Foothill Railway, and my homestead sits a mile up this draw. You are shaking like a wet dog, and the sky is fixing to open up again inside the hour. I will take you there to get dry and warm, and then we will decide together what ought to be done about the rest of it." Wilhelmina looked back once, downstream, to where the wreck of her father's wagon lay half submerged among the boulders, and then up the muddy track toward town, toward the church, toward the life that had been arranged for her by men who had never once asked what she wanted. Then she looked at Warren Granger, at his outstretched hand, and made the second reckless decision of that long, terrible day. She took it. Warren's homestead was a snug two-room cabin of hand-hewn logs set against a stand of black oak, with a spring house, a corral holding 2 horses and a mule, and a weathered gray hay barn standing off to one side like an old sentinel. He gave her his spare shirt and a pair of wool trousers cinched with a length of rope, and turned his back with a courtesy that struck her as almost old-fashioned while she changed behind a hung blanket, and he built up the fire in the stone hearth until the little cabin filled with warmth and the smell of wood smoke and drying wool. He did not press her for her story that first evening. He gave her hot coffee and a plate of beans and salt pork, and he talked instead, easily, about the railroad line he was surveying through the foothills, about the avalanche that had closed the high pass above Bear Valley not 3 weeks past and buried a freight team under snow 12 feet deep, about the strange, cruel beauty of a country that could kill you and feed you in the same breath. Wilhelmina, wrapped in a horse blanket by his fire, found herself grateful for his restraint even as she understood it would not last. It did not last past morning. Warren rode into Placer Hollow before first light to check on the damage the flood had done to the rail grading crew's supply road, and he came back 2 hours later with his jaw set hard and a folded broadsheet in his coat pocket. He found Wilhelmina in the cabin's small kitchen, having made herself useful scrubbing the breakfast pot, and he set the paper down on the table without a word. Missing, it read, in heavy black type. Wilhelmina Boone, aged 25, fled the wedding of Percival Caldwell on the morning of April the 9th, believed to have taken with her certain items of value belonging to the Caldwell family. A reward of $200 is offered by Mr. Cornelius Caldwell for information leading to her safe return or the recovery of the stolen property. Wilhelmina's hands had gone very still on the pot. Stolen property, Warren repeated, watching her face rather than the paper. That is a serious word to print about a schoolteacher. I stole nothing. Her voice came out low and fierce, and she made herself meet his eyes, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she thought he must surely hear it. I took my own mother's Bible, and $40 my own father gave me not a week past. Money I had earned myself teaching sums to half the children in that town, back before the council decided a schoolhouse was not worth the lumber. I took nothing that was not mine, Mr. Granger, and I would swear it on that very Bible if you asked me to. I have not asked you to swear anything. He folded the broadsheet slowly and set it aside, and for a long moment he only looked at her, and she understood that whatever he decided in the next few seconds would determine the whole shape of what came after. There is $200 riding on your capture, he said finally. That is more money than most men in this county see in a year of honest work. I expect there will be riders out from here to the American River looking for you within the week. Then you had best decide quickly, sir, whether you mean to collect that reward. She lifted her chin, bracing herself the way she had learned to brace herself against her whole life's disappointments. I will not run from you. I have nowhere left to run. Something shifted in Warren Granger's weathered face then, some decision arriving and settling into place, and he shook his head slowly. I have spent the better part of a year, he said, watching Cornelius Caldwell get rich off land that was not honestly his to take, and watching good men afraid to say so out loud because he owns the bank note on half this valley. I do not know your whole story yet, Miss Boone, and I mean to hear it. But I have looked at enough forged land grants this winter to know the particular shape of a Caldwell lie when I see one printed on a broadsheet, and this one has that shape. He walked to the door and looked out across the yard toward the old gray barn, its hay doors standing open to the morning air, and then back at her. There is a loft in that barn with clean straw and a good roof, and nobody rides out this far but me, he said. You will stay there until we have sorted out the truth of this, and I will not be turning you in to any man, sheriff or Caldwell or otherwise, until I understand exactly what it is I would be handing over. It was, Wilhelmina would think later, the single kindest sentence anyone had spoken to her in a very long time, and she had to look away from him and blink hard at the window to keep from weeping in front of a man she had known less than a day. For 4 days, Wilhelmina Boone lived in the hayloft of Warren Granger's barn, sleeping on a nest of clean straw and an old quilt he brought her from the cabin, eating meals he carried out to her twice a day wrapped in cloth, and watching the world through a knot-hole in the barn siding, while she waited to learn whether the life she had run from would ever let her go. She learned in those 4 days that Warren Granger was not a simple man, whatever his simple homestead might have suggested. He had come west from Ohio in '65, after the war, with an engineering education and no family left to keep him tethered, and he had worked his way up through survey crews until the Sierra Foothill Railway had put him in charge of laying the grade for a new spur line meant to reach the last of the mining camps, and the timber stands above Placer Hollow. He told her, sitting on an overturned crate at the foot of the loft ladder while she picked straw from her hair, about the discrepancies he had begun finding the previous autumn. Parcels of land along the proposed right-of-way that the county recorder's books showed as belonging to homesteaders, families who had proved up their claims honestly after the gold rush had burned itself out, and yet which now appeared, on paper filed only months ago, to belong instead to the Caldwell Land and Development Company. "Your father is Jedediah Boone," Warren said on the second evening, watching her closely. "I have seen his name in those very books. 160 acres along Deer Creek, filed in 1852, and yet there is a second filing dated this past January claiming the same parcel was sold to Cornelius Caldwell for a sum of $1. Wilhelmina's hands had gone cold around her tin coffee cup. "My father would never sell that land. He has worked it 20 years. It is the only thing he has left of my mother, who is buried on that hill." "I did not think he would," Warren said quietly. "Which is why I have spent the better part of a year trying to prove, without getting myself thrown off this railroad or worse, that Cornelius Caldwell has been forging signatures in the recorder's office to steal land out from under decent people, while the rest of the county is too busy building a railroad to notice." It was then, sitting in the gathering dark of the barn with the smell of hay and horses around them, that Wilhelmina finally told him the whole of it. How her father had come to her 3 months past, ashen and shaking, saying that Caldwell had produced a note, supposedly signed by Jedediah himself, claiming a debt of $1,100 that her father swore he had never incurred. How Caldwell had come to their door not as a creditor but almost gently, offering a way to make the whole ugly matter disappear, if only Wilhelmina would consent to marry his son Percival and unite the two families' interests along Deer Creek. How her father, broken and frightened and unwilling to see her, sacrificed, had nonetheless finally agreed, believing wrongly that there was no other way to save the only land he had left. "I told myself I could bear it," Wilhelmina said, staring at her own hands. "For his sake. Percival is not a cruel man, only a weak one, entirely under his father's thumb, and I thought perhaps I could build some manner of decent life even inside such a bargain. But 2 nights before the wedding I found papers in old Mr. Caldwell's study, while I was there for a supper I could not politely refuse. Deeds, Mr. Granger. A dozen of them, all in that same strange hand, all bearing dates within the last year, all claiming land that had belonged to families along this whole valley for 20 years. My father's name among them, but not only his. I understood then that I was not being married into a family. I was being sold as a way of silencing a theft, so that my father would never dare speak against the man who had become, on paper, his own son's father-in-law." Warren was very still. "You saw the deeds themselves. You could describe them." "I have not merely seen them," Wilhelmina said, and something fierce and clever came into her face even through her exhaustion. The look, Warren thought, of a woman used to solving problems for children twice her patience's worth, and thoroughly unwilling to be beaten by a man simply because he was rich. I copied 3 of them into the back pages of my mother's Bible before I fled that house, word for word in the dark, by a single candle, terrified the whole while that I would be discovered. It is in my satchel, Mr. Granger, which came out of that creek with me, and which I have not let out of my sight since. Warren Granger sat back slowly on the crate and looked at her for a long moment in the fading light, and something in his pale eyes was no longer merely careful. It was something closer to admiration, unguarded and plain. "Miss Boone," he said, "I believe you may have just handed me the very evidence I have spent a year of my life hunting for." The trouble, they both understood before the words had fully settled between them, was that evidence copied into a schoolteacher's Bible by a woman currently wanted for theft would convince no judge on its own, and that Cornelius Caldwell had $200 riding on finding her first. That trouble arrived at Warren's door on the 5th morning in the shape of Sheriff Nathaniel Cobb, a broad, gray-mustached man who had kept the peace in Placer Hollow for 11 years, and had, in that time, developed a healthy and well-earned distrust of Cornelius Caldwell that he was none the less too cautious, or too outnumbered, to act upon openly. Wilhelmina, warned by the sound of hooves in the yard, had gone still and silent in the loft, burrowing down beneath the loose hay with her satchel clutched to her chest, while below her Warren met the sheriff in the barn doorway with his hat pushed back and an expression of unhurried patience that gave nothing away. "Warren." Cobb's horse blew and stamped in the cool morning air. "You will have heard, I expect, that the Boone girl has gone missing, ran clean out of her own wedding 5 days past, and Cornelius Caldwell is fit to be tied about it, wants every able man in the county out looking." "I heard something of it," Warren allowed. "You know this country better than any man on my payroll on account of all that surveying you do. I would consider it a favor, Warren, if you would ride the high trails toward Bear Valley for me over the next few days. If she is out there alone in this weather, with the melt running the way it is and another storm sitting up over the ridge, she has not got long." Wilhelmina, 30 feet above them, lay perfectly still and listened to her own heartbeat pound in her ears, and thought, with a wild half-hysterical urge to laugh, that she had never in her life been quite so directly the subject of a conversation happening directly beneath her. "I will ride out for you, Nathaniel," Warren said, after a pause just long enough to be natural and not one heartbeat longer. "You have my word on it. Bear Valley and the old mining road both, since I know them best." "I am obliged." Cobb hesitated, and something more careful came into his voice. "I will tell you plain, Warren, since I know you for an honest man, and there are not so many of those left in this county that I can afford to waste words on the wrong ones. I do not entirely credit this business about stolen property. Cornelius Caldwell is not a man who loses $200 easily, and it strikes me strange that he would offer that sum over a Bible and $40, which is the whole of what her own father tells me privately went missing along with her. I think there is more to this wedding than has been printed on that broadsheet, but I have not got the proof of it, and until I do, my hands are somewhat tied." "If I should learn anything on the trail," Warren said carefully, "you would be the first man I would bring it to." Cobb nodded, satisfied, and turned his horse, and Warren stood in the yard watching him ride away down the muddy track toward town until the hoofbeats had faded entirely into the wind. Only then did he climb the loft ladder to find Wilhelmina sitting up in the straw, pale but steady, her satchel still clutched against her. "You heard all that," Warren said. "I heard a great deal of it, yes." She managed something close to a smile, though it trembled at the edges. "Your sheriff does not sound entirely convinced of my villainy." "Nathaniel Cobb is a better man than his position generally allows him to be," Warren said. "But he cannot act on suspicion alone, not against a man who holds the note on half the businesses in Placer Hollow. We are going to need more than a Bible full of copied deeds and one sheriff's private doubts." He crouched at the top of the ladder, studying her face in the dim gold light filtering through the hay doors. "Your father's old partner, Silas Tuttle." I have heard your father speak of him, back when I bought feed off Jedediah's place 2 winters past. Runs cattle up past the old copper flat diggings. Silas is like an uncle to me, Wilhelmina said, startled. But how do you know of him? Because I have been trying for a year to find one honest man in this valley willing to say, in front of a judge, that he witnessed Cornelius Caldwell's dealings before the fraud began. Someone who has known your father's true circumstances long enough to swear to the truth of that original claim. Warren's jaw tightened with new resolve. If Silas Tuttle has known your father 20 years, he may hold papers, or memories, or simply the standing in this county to be believed, where a runaway bride and a railroad surveyor might not be. And if your father entrusted him with anything at all before this trouble began, that trail leads through Copper Flat, which sits just below the pass at Bear Valley. The same pass you have just promised Sheriff Cobb you would search, Wilhelmina said slowly, understanding dawning. The very same. For the first time since she had known him, something like a genuine, reckless grin broke across Warren Granger's face. It seems, Miss Boone, that I am about to go looking for you exactly where you need to be found. They left before dawn the next morning, while the sky was still the color of a gun barrel, and the air held that particular sharp cold of the high country before the sun had climbed over the ridge. Wilhelmina rode her father's gray gelding, recovered from the creek bottom 2 days past by one of Warren's hired hands and quietly stabled out of sight, and Warren rode a sturdy bay mare he called Clementine, with a second-pack mule trailing behind laden with bedrolls, oilcloth, and enough hardtack and dried meat to see them through several days on the trail. Wilhelmina had traded her ruined wedding silk for a set of plain wool riding clothes Warren had produced from somewhere without explanation, and had bound her dark hair back beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face from any rider they might pass. If we meet anyone on the road, Warren told her as they climbed out of the draw and onto the old mining trail that switchbacked up toward Bear Valley, you are my cousin, come out from Sacramento to help nurse my aunt who has taken sick up at Copper Flat. Keep your hat low and let me do the talking. I am fully capable of talking, Mr. Granger, Wilhelmina said, with a dryness that made him glance sideways at her, surprised into a short laugh. I have managed a room of 40 children through a smallpox scare and a flooded schoolhouse both in the same winter. I believe I can manage a lie about a fictional aunt. I do not doubt your capability in the slightest, Warren said, and there was something warm beneath the words that had not been there in his careful courtesies of the first days. It is only that I have grown fond of the notion of keeping you alive through this, and a schoolteacher's honest face is a difficult thing to disguise. They climbed for 3 hours through stands of ponderosa pines still dripping from the last storm, the trail growing steeper, and the snow beginning to appear first in shaded hollows, and then, as they gained elevation, in unbroken drifts that reached the horses' knees. Warren rode ahead where the drifts were deepest, testing the crust with care, and twice made them backtrack entirely rather than risk a crossing he did not like the look of. The whole slope above us let go 3 weeks past, he explained, when Wilhelmina asked why he studied the ridgeline so intently. Buried a freight team from the Excelsior mine, 2 men and 6 mules, under snow deep enough that they were not found until the thaw uncovered them a week later. A winter like this one packs the high snowpack unstable as loose sugar. It wants only a sound, sometimes, or the wrong weight in the wrong place, to bring the whole mountainside down. It was perhaps an hour past noon, as they crossed a long, open shoulder of the mountain where the trail ran directly beneath a steep snow-loaded slope, that Warren's caution proved itself entirely justified. He had just called back to Wilhelmina to keep her voice low and her pace steady, when a sound like distant thunder rolled down from somewhere above them, and Warren's head snapped up toward the ridge. "Snow slide," he said, sharp and urgent. "Ride. Now do not look back, ride for the rocks below the trail." Wilhelmina did not question him. She dug her heels into the gelding's flanks and rode hard down the exposed shoulder of trail toward a jumbled outcrop of granite boulders that broke the slope below them, hearing behind her a roar building like a train coming down out of the sky, and beneath that roar Warren's voice shouting her name, and the mule braying in terror as it fought its lead rope. She reached the boulders and threw herself from the saddle, dragging the gelding's head down and pressing herself against the cold stone, and an instant later Warren crashed in beside her, hauling Clementine's reins short, just as a wall of snow and broken timber thundered past not 40 feet above where they crouched, close enough that the wind of its passing snatched the hat from Wilhelmina's head and flung it spinning down the mountainside. The roar took perhaps 10 seconds to pass, though it felt to Wilhelmina like the whole slow unwinding of a lifetime, and then the mountain fell silent again except for the ragged sound of their own breathing and the horses' terrified snorting. "Are you hurt?" Warren's hands were on her shoulders, turning her, his gray eyes moving over her face and body with a fierce, searching intensity that had nothing careful left in it at all. "I am unhurt," Wilhelmina managed, though her whole body was shaking now that the danger had passed, the way it had shaken in Coldwater Creek 5 days before. "You knew. You heard it coming before I could hear anything at all." "I have spent a year up in this country listening to mountains talk," Warren said, and his voice was rougher than she had yet heard it. "I have buried enough good men's mistakes to know the sound of one about to be made." His hands had not yet left her shoulders. "I could not have borne it," he said low, "if that slide had taken you instead of me." They were close enough now that Wilhelmina could see the fine lines of exhaustion and worry around his eyes, could feel the warmth of him even through the cold mountain air, and for one long, unguarded moment neither of them moved at all. "You have known me 5 days, Mr. Granger," she said softly, though she did not step back. "I have known you 5 days," he agreed. "I have also watched you swim a flooded creek without weeping, hide 4 days in a hayloft without complaint, and copy stolen deeds into a Bible by candlelight to save your own father's land. I find I am not overly concerned with how long I have known you, Miss Boone, only with the plain fact that I do." It was not, in the end, a grand or practiced kiss. It was brief and a little clumsy, both of them still trembling from the near miss of the slide, his cold hand coming up to cradle her jaw with a gentleness that startled her more than the kiss itself, and when they finally drew apart Wilhelmina found herself laughing, unsteady and disbelieving, at the sheer strangeness of falling in love on a mountainside minutes after nearly being buried alive. "We ought to move on," Warren said, though he did not sound entirely certain he wished to. "Before the light fails, and before I forget entirely what business brought us up this mountain." They reached the ruins of the old copper flat diggings as the sun was dropping toward the western ridges, a scatter of collapsed timber shacks and rusted mining equipment left behind when the gold rush had burned itself out 15 years before, the whole camp gone quiet and ghostly under its blanket of late snow. Warren had planned for them to shelter there only long enough to rest the horses before pushing on to Sela's Tuttle's ranch another 5 miles beyond. But as they picked their way through the ruined camp, Wilhelmina caught his arm suddenly and pointed toward a thin thread of wood smoke rising from behind a half-collapsed assay office. They approached carefully, and it was Warren who called out first, his voice pitched to carry but not to alarm, and a moment later a grizzled figure emerged from behind the ruined building with a shotgun leveled and steady, only to lower it slowly in evident astonishment at the sight of the woman beside Warren's horse. "Lord in heaven," the old man said. "Willa Boone, I had heard you were lost or worse, girl, and here you sit a horse like nothing in this world could touch you." "Sela's." Wilhelmina slid from the saddle and crossed the frozen ground to embrace the old miner, who smelled of wood smoke and horse and the particular leather and tobacco scent she remembered from childhood visits to her father's ranch. "You are camped clear out here." "Is my father?" "Your father is safe so far as I know, though under a watchful eye," Sela's Tuttle said grimly, holstering the shotgun. Caldwell's men have been round his place twice since your wedding fell through, looking for word of you, and I did not much like the notion of them finding my own trail so easily. So I have kept to the old camp these last days rather than risk leading anyone to my ranch. I have something there your father asked me to hold safe for you, girl, some years back, when this whole ugly business with Caldwell first began to smell wrong to him. Silas led them into the ruined assay office, which he had rigged with canvas and a small stove into a rough but livable camp, and from beneath a loose floorboard he drew out an oilskin packet, worn soft with age, which he pressed into Wilhelmina's hands. "Your father's original deed to the Deer Creek land," Silas said, "signed and witnessed in '52, along with a letter he wrote near 2 years back, when Caldwell first started sniffing round that parcel, naming 3 other families along the creek whose land Caldwell had already begun trying to claim by trickery. He asked me to keep it hid until such time as it might do some good, and I am beginning to think, Willa, that time has come." Warren, crouched beside the small stove studying the papers by lantern light, let out a long breath. "This, alongside your copied deeds and whatever discrepancies I have documented in the county books, would be enough to bring formal charges. Not merely doubts, Silas. Charges a judge could not ignore." It was at that moment, with the papers spread between them and something like real hope kindling for the first time in days, that the sound of hoofbeats reached them from the direction of the old mining road, several horses moving fast, and Silas Tuttle was on his feet with the shotgun in hand before Warren had even finished blowing out the lantern. They need not have feared discovery in the end, not that particular evening, for the rider who came pounding into the ruined camp moments later, breathless and half-frozen, proved to be no bounty hunter at all but Percival Caldwell himself, alone, without escort, his fine city coat torn on brush and his horse lathered white with hard riding. Miss Boone. He half fell from the saddle, and Wilhelmina, emerging cautiously from the assay office at Warren's side, stared at her almost husband in genuine astonishment. Percival had never once, in the whole of their brief and miserable courtship, struck her as a man capable of hard riding through mountain country in failing light. "Thank God I have found you before my father's men did. Percival," Wilhelmina's voice was wary. "Why have you come?" "Because I have finally understood what my own father is, and I could not live with myself another day pretending I had not." Percival's face, in the lantern light Silas now dared to relight, was gray with exhaustion and something that looked very much like shame. "He means to burn the recorder's original books this very week, Miss Boone, and blame the fire on drifters, to erase every trace of the true filings before any judge can compare them against his forged claims. And when he learned yesterday that a rider had spotted a woman answering your description on the Copper Flat Road, he did not send men to bring you home safely. He sent Amos Vance and 4 hired guns to make certain you never reach a courthouse alive to tell what you saw in his study that night." The words fell into the small, ruined camp like stones into still water, and Wilhelmina felt Warren's hand find hers in the darkness, steady and sure. "You are telling us," Warren said slowly, "that your own father has sent armed men to kill her." "I am telling you that my father has convinced himself he has no other choice left, and a man convinced he has no choice is the most dangerous creature alive," Percival said. "I rode ahead of them by perhaps 2 hours on the excuse of scouting the road, but Vance is no fool, and he knows this country better than I do. He will find Silas Tuttle's involvement soon enough if he has not already. I am sorry, Miss Boone, for every part I played in bringing you to this. I want no part of it any longer, and I mean to help however I am able." Silas Tuttle spat into the fire, unimpressed by apologies but plainly weighing the practical value of the warning. "My ranch sits 2 miles further on at the mouth of the Copper Flat Road. There is no other way down off this mountain before full dark, not with the melt running the way it is on every other trail. If Vance and his men are coming, they will come to my ranch, because that is where the road leads, and that is where we will be." "Then we had best not be caught standing in an open yard when they arrive," Warren said, and something had settled into his voice now, cold and clear and entirely without panic. The voice, Wilhelmina thought, of a man who had spent a year quietly gathering the courage to stand against exactly this kind of danger, and had finally arrived at the place where standing was required. "How many men does Silas keep at the ranch?" "2 hired hands, both good shots, and my own gun besides," Silas said. "Against Vance's 4, and Vance himself makes 5. We are outnumbered but not helpless, not on ground I have known 30 years and they have never seen at all." They rode the last 2 miles to Tuttle's ranch in the deepening dark, the temperature dropping hard now that the sun was fully gone, and as they came down into the small hollow where Silas kept his cattle and his modest ranch house, Warren began, in a low, urgent voice, to lay out a plan. The ranch sat in a natural bowl of land with a single approach road and steep timbered slopes rising on both sides, a barn and corral to the east of the house, and a spring house and root cellar to the west. Warren had spent a year mapping exactly this kind of terrain for the railroad, learning to read the shape of land the way other men read a printed page, and he saw immediately the advantage the ground itself might offer against men who did not know it. "Vance will expect a house full of frightened people and perhaps 2 guns," Warren said, as they unsaddled the horses in the dim barn by lantern light, Percival helping with a nervous energy that suggested he was grateful for anything useful to do with his hands. "He will not expect us to know he is coming, and he will not expect us to use the dark against him rather than merely hide from it." The plan they built, in the hour before Vance's men were likely to arrive, relied on neither numbers nor firepower, but on exactly the kind of deception Warren had learned to practice in 5 careful days of hiding a fugitive from a sheriff's own search party. Silas's 2 hired hands, a taciturn Cornishman named Trevanion, and a young Miwok vaquero named Joaquin who had worked the ranch 3 seasons, were sent up into the timber on either slope with instructions to light small signal fires at staggered intervals, the moment Vance's party entered the hollow. Fires meant to suggest, from below, a ring of armed watchers rather than 2 solitary men. Percival, whose horse and voice both would be recognized by Vance's crew, was to ride hard the moment the plan was set into motion, not toward the ranch but back down the Copper Flat Road toward Placer Hollow, to fetch Sheriff Cobb, gambling everything on reaching town and back before the confrontation resolved itself one way or another. Wilhelmina, when Warren moved to suggest she remain hidden in the root cellar with the oilskin packet of deeds for safekeeping, met his eyes steadily in the lantern light and shook her head. "I have hidden in 1 hayloft and 1 root cellar already this week, Mr. Granger, and I begin to think I am done with hiding," she said. "I can load a rifle as well as any man on this ranch, and I know this valley's true history better than anyone here besides Silas and my own father. If Vance's men mean to take that evidence by force, I would rather stand where I can see them coming than wait blind in a hole in the ground." Warren studied her for a long moment, and Wilhelmina watched something in him war between the fierce instinct to protect her at any cost and the plain respect for her judgment that had been growing in him with every mile of this journey. And she saw, with a warmth that steadied her more than any promise of safety could have, that the respect won. "You will stay at the house, then, with a rifle at the window and Silas beside you," Warren said. "I will take the yard between the house and the barn, since that is the ground Vance's men will have to cross to reach either building, and it is ground I have already walked twice this evening in the dark." It was perhaps 2 hours past full dark when Amos Vance's party came riding cautiously down the Copper Flat Road into the hollow, 5 mounted shapes visible against the last pale gray of the western sky, and Warren, crouched behind an overturned wagon at the edge of the yard with Silas's spare rifle across his knees, watched them draw rein at the sight of small fires flickering high on both timbered slopes above the ranch. "Hold there," Vance called out. a lean, hard-faced man Warren had seen once before, months back, collecting overdue notes on Caldwell's behalf from a widow near Auburn with a coldness that had turned Warren's stomach even then. "Tuttle, I know you are in there. We have come for the Boone woman and whatever papers she has been carrying, and we mean to have them one way or another." "You have come a long way for nothing, then." Silas Tuttle's voice rang out from the darkened porch, steady despite his years. "There is no woman here, only an old rancher and his hired hands, and you would do well to turn round and ride out the way you came before somebody's mother has to bury him." Vance laughed, short and humorless, and gestured his men to fan out, but Warren saw the hesitation in the way they moved, saw eyes flicking up toward the fires burning on both ridgelines, uncertain how many rifles those fires might represent, and understood that the deception was, for the moment, holding. It was Wilhelmina's voice, calm and clear from the lit window of the ranch house, that came next, and Warren felt his heart lurch with equal parts terror and fierce pride at the sound of it. "Mr. Vance," she called, "you may tell Cornelius Caldwell that I have his forged deeds copied in my own hand, along with my father's original filing from 1852, and 3 sworn accounts from families whose land he has stolen the same way mine was nearly stolen. If you kill me here tonight, that evidence goes with the sheriff who already rides toward this ranch even as we speak, and Mr. Caldwell will hang for murder atop everything else. If you ride away now, you may yet tell him you simply never found me at all." For a long, taut moment nothing moved in the dark hollow but the small flickering fires on the ridges and the restless stamping of the horses, and Warren, watching from behind the wagon, saw Vance turn his head, weighing the bluff, weighing the sheriff's name, weighing, Warren suspected, his own considerable dislike of dying for another man's crimes. It was in that moment of hesitation that new hoofbeats sounded on the road behind Vance's party, many of them, moving fast, and a familiar gruff voice called out across the hollow, "Amos Vance, you are under arrest along with any man riding with you for conspiracy and attempted murder on the sworn complaint of Percival Caldwell." Sheriff Nathaniel Cobb rode into the firelight at the head of 6 mounted deputies, Percival white-faced but resolute at his side, and behind them, unmistakable even in the dark, the heavy figure of Cornelius Caldwell himself, wrists bound, flanked by 2 more of Cobb's men. "You will forgive me for not waiting on your convenience, Vance," Cobb went on, his voice hard as flint, "but your employer here rode out from Placer Hollow not an hour past to personally oversee the burning of this county's original land records, and was kind enough to say a great many incriminating things to me directly, believing me still asleep at my desk, when in fact I had been waiting 3 days for exactly such a foolish mistake." Cornelius Caldwell's face, caught in the firelight, was a study in disbelief curdling rapidly into rage. "This is an outrage, Cobb. You have no proof of anything. This is the word of a runaway thief and my own weak-willed son against 160 acres of forged deeds sitting this very moment in a ranch house not 30 feet from where you stand," Wilhelmina called from the window, and there was something in her voice now that rang with all the authority of a schoolteacher who had spent years learning exactly how to make grown men listen, along with the testimony of every family along Deer Creek whose land you stole the same way you tried to steal mine. "It is over, Mr. Caldwell. You may set down whatever plan you had left and come along quietly, or you may continue shouting into the dark, but either way, the truth has already outrun you. Amos Vance, given a clear choice between hanging for a rich man's crimes and surrendering his weapons to a sheriff's posse, 6 strong, made the only sensible decision available to him, and lowered his rifle to the ground with a curse. His men followed suit a moment later, and the confrontation that Wilhelmina and Warren had both feared might end in bloodshed dissolved instead into the far less dramatic business of Cobb's deputies collecting weapons and reading out warrants by lantern light, while Cornelius Caldwell sputtered protests that grew steadily quieter as the reality of his situation settled over him. Not a single shot had been fired. Warren rose from behind the overturned wagon at last, setting down the rifle he had not needed to use, and crossed the dark yard to where Wilhelmina had come out onto the porch. And when she reached him, she did not stop to consider propriety or the watching crowd of deputies and hired hands, only put her arms around him and held on as though she meant never entirely to let go. "You are shaking," Warren murmured into her hair. "So are you," Wilhelmina said, and felt him laugh, low and unsteady, against her. The weeks that followed unfolded with the particular strange quiet that comes after a long storm has finally blown itself out. Cornelius Caldwell was held over for trial on charges of land fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder, and the county recorder's office, once Warren's survey documentation, was laid alongside Jedediah Boone's original 1852 filing and the sworn testimony of a dozen other Deer Creek families, moved with unusual speed to restore every stolen parcel to its rightful owner. Percival Caldwell, whose testimony against his own father had proved decisive in securing the arrest, sold what remained of his family's holdings that were not tied up in restitution, and departed for San Francisco within the month, with a plain letter to Wilhelmina wishing her every happiness and admitting, with more grace than she had ever known him to possess, that he had never once truly wanted the marriage either, only lacked the courage to refuse it. Jedediah Boone, reunited with his daughter in a scene neither of them would ever fully manage to describe to anyone else without their voices breaking, held his 160 acres along Deer Creek free and clear for the first time in a year, and made no secret at all of his opinion regarding the railroad surveyor who had brought his daughter home to him safe. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to repay, Mr. Granger," Jedediah said, gripping Warren's hand hard on the porch of the Boone Ranch house on a warm afternoon some 3 weeks after the siege at Tuttle's Ranch. "You owe me nothing, sir," Warren said. "I only did what any decent man would have done, finding a woman in trouble and refusing to look away from it. There are not so many decent men in this county as you might hope," Jedediah said dryly, "and I have met a fair sampling of the indecent variety this past year to know the difference plainly enough." It was Sierra Foothill Railway itself, in the end, that offered the largest reward, once the full scope of Cornelius Caldwell's fraud became clear. He had been embezzling not only from homesteaders but from the railroad's own right-of-way payments, pocketing funds meant to compensate families for land the line legitimately needed, and pinning the shortfall on delayed construction costs. The railroad's regional superintendent, a cautious man named Alden Fitch, who had spent the better part of the previous year quietly discouraging Warren from pursuing his suspicions too loudly, arrived in Placer Hollow personally to offer Warren both a promotion and a reward of $500 for exposing the fraud, with an additional $200 set aside by the county itself in recognition of the return of stolen land to its rightful owners. Wilhelmina, sitting beside Warren on the steps of the Placer Hollow courthouse the afternoon that reward was formally offered, felt him take her hand before he had even finished hearing out Mr. Fitch's careful, apologetic speech. "I am obliged for the recognition, Mr. Fitch," Warren said, once the superintendent had finished, "and I will accept the promotion gladly, since it seems this line could use an engineer willing to look at his own books honestly. But I have no need of $700 for myself, and I expect Miss Boone feels much the same." "I do, in fact," Wilhelmina said, and there was a light in her eyes now that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a plan she had been quietly nursing since the very first days of her ordeal. "This town has needed a proper schoolhouse for 3 years, Mr. Fitch, ever since the old council decided the lumber was better spent on a second saloon than on the children who will someday run this valley. I would ask that the reward money be given instead toward the building of that school, with enough left over for books and a proper stove, so that no other family in this county need choose between an education and a roof over their heads. Alden Fitch, who had come prepared to argue over the size of a reward, and found himself instead faced with a request to redirect it entirely toward the public good, could only nod, somewhat bemused, and agree that the railroad would be glad to have its name associated with such a project. The schoolhouse rose that summer on a gentle rise of land just outside town, timber freshly cut and milled, with glass windows shipped up from Sacramento, and a bell that Silas Tuttle donated from an old mining camp chapel long since abandoned, and Wilhelmina Boone stood in its single bright classroom on the morning of its opening, watching a dozen children file in with the particular mixture of terror and hope she remembered from her own first days trying to teach in a borrowed church basement, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was standing exactly where she was meant to stand. Warren Granger married her on a clear morning in late June, in a modest ceremony held not in the church where her first wedding had never quite taken place, but in the meadow below his homestead, with Jedediah Boone giving his daughter away with tears he made no effort to hide, and Silas Tuttle standing as Warren's own witness with the shotgun he had once leveled at strangers now left safely behind at his ranch. Sheriff Cobb attended in his best coat, and half the schoolchildren came with wildflowers gathered along the creek, and the whole valley, it seemed, turned out to see the runaway bride finally marry a man of her own choosing. "I do not believe," Wilhelmina said to him quietly, as they stood together afterward watching the last of the afternoon light gild the foothills gold, "that I have ever properly thanked you for that first day, for catching me out of that creek, and for choosing not to turn me over to anyone at all, when it would have been so very much simpler for you to do so." "It was never simple," Warren said, drawing her close against him, "not from the very first moment I pulled you out of that water. But I have found in this last year that the things worth having rarely are." He pressed a kiss to her hair and looked out over the valley they had both, in their own separate ways, fought so hard to set right. "I do not regret a single dangerous mile of it, Wilhelmina Boone, not the bridge, nor the barn, nor the mountain, nor the ranch. I would ride every one of them again, so long as it led me back to you." Below them in the meadow, the schoolchildren's laughter carried on the warm evening wind, and somewhere down the valley, the first whistle of a Sierra foothill railway locomotive echoed off the ridgelines, carrying its own promise of a country still being built, honestly this time, one plain and hard-won mile at a time. Wilhelmina Boone Granger stood in the circle of her husband's arms and watched the sun go down gold and quiet over the foothills that had so nearly cost them everything, and thought that she had never, in all her 25 years, felt so entirely and safely at home.